Chapter 26. "Don't shoot," Nirasawa said, a thick, wet quality to his voice, as if he were speaking through a mouthful of soup. He stepped toward them, holding out Briggs's body as if it was some kind of token of surrender. What was left of the synthetic's face was held in an expression of unhappiness, almost sorrow. An android. Thank God Keen wasn't. We never would have made it off that shuttle. Lara shook her head. Considering where they were now, what Ellis had done to himself, maybe she shouldn't be so thankful. Nirasawa came closer, and Lara stood up, Jess and Noguchi following suit, though neither of them lowered their weapons. Lara tucked hers into her belt, stepping towards the damaged android. Ellis was the robotics expert, but she knew enough about synth programming to know that it was unlikely that this was some kind of trick. Synthetics didn't generally work that way. They had to be directed to be misleading, and it was obvious that Briggs wasn't capable of redesigning a program. Not at the moment. Nirasawa looked terrible, the right side of his face clawed to ribbons. The right eye had drooled out of its socket, lying across the ruptured mass of his cheek in a seeping, oozing bath of creamy lubricant. The white liquid had almost completely covered the front of his suit, and part of Briggs's. He looked at Lara with his good eye, and she saw that his unhappiness was real, or as real as his synthized emotional makeup would allow. "Please, you must help Mr. Briggs," he gurgled. Lara sighed, a little surprised at her feeling of pity for the bodyguard, although she supposed she knew where it came from. It wasn't his fault that he'd been created to protect assholes like Briggs. It was probably his primary function, and with Briggs as good as dead, Nirasawa was now obsolete. "Couldn't happen to a nicer guy," Jess muttered, stepping forward to join them. Noguchi stood watch, scanning the trees, Max as still as a statue. Lara hoped he was resting, or at least not in any pain. "When I tried to pull it off him, he started to choke," Nirasawa said. "I'm afraid that part of my contingency awareness has been damaged. I don't know what to do." Jess leaned down, reaching out to tap at the shell of the embryo carrier. It wobbled, and Lara saw its tail slide from around Briggs's neck, loosening. Jess put his burner down and grabbed two of its multi-jointed legs with each hand, the facehugger coming away easily. A thin fluid dribbled out of Briggs's slack mouth. Still unconscious, he moaned, turning his head as Jess dropped the dead carrier onto the grass. "Too late," Lara said, unable to muster any sympathy for the executive. Jess was right. If anyone deserved such a death, it was Lucas Briggs. Nirasawa blinked, his unsocketed eye twitching on his face with a tiny wet smacking noise. "It is my job to protect him." Even Jess seemed to feel bad for the synthetic. "Look, your boss is beyond help," he said. "He's been implanted with a parasitic embryo that will kill him. There's nothing that anyone can do, and probably nothing you could have done to stop it. You'll have to—" "Quiet," Noguchi whispered, and Lara tensed, pulling her 9mm, glancing back to see that Ellis had both of Max's arms raised again. Jess scooped up his burner and stepped closer to Lara. Silence for a moment, and then there was the faintest sound of movement in the trees ahead of them, a sound like some stealthy creature might make, sliding through the dark. Lara saw a branch move, then another, meters away, but couldn't see what was making them rustle. Noguchi took off her mask and dropped it, speaking softly, her shoulders set, her gaze unwavering. "We're splitting up," she said, and Lara knew from the sound of her voice that this time there wasn't going to be any discussion. 5 hunters stepped out from the cover of the jungle, cloaked, armed only with blades. When Noguchi saw who was with them, she understood, not for the first time, that there were some fates that couldn't be avoided. Shouldn't be. "We're splitting up," Noguchi said, dropping her burner next to her mask. If they'd been armed with heavier weapons, she probably would have passed, but as it was, the situation felt too much like an opportunity, the circumstances too perfect for coincidence. There was a blooded she didn't know, 3 novices, and Shorty. When they saw her throw her weapon down, Shorty clattered to his leader, Noguchi too far away to hear the exchange, but knowing what it was all about all the same. Challenge. Honor. Ellis would see Jess and Lara to the ship. They'd be fine. Except there was the problem of the rest of the hunters. Noguchi felt a twinge of doubt, evaluating the group. They'd let her fight Shorty, but would kill her when it was over, assuming she survived. Hunters loved an honor match, but they wouldn't let her walk away afterward. Unless... Nirasawa, she said, still watching the hunters, watching as another novice took Shorty's blade from him. It's too late for you to help your master, but if there's any part of your programming that understands revenge, then now's the time to access it. These are the beings responsible for his condition. The hunters uncloaked, stepping farther away from the backdrop of the jungle. Shorty took off his mask, throwing it aside, and the hunters began to trill to one another, clicking and clattering excitedly. I understand, Nirasawa said, and Noguchi glanced back to see that he put his master down, laying him gently in the grass. The rest of you get to the ship, Noguchi said. I'll be there as soon as I can. Machiko, Lara started, but Noguchi shook her head. There wasn't anything that she or Jess could say that would change their mind. I have unfinished business here, she said grimly, and started across the clearing, Nirasawa falling in behind her. Perhaps it was lunacy. Perhaps she'd only get herself killed, fighting for an integrity that wasn't even in question. But perhaps, after all this time, she'd finally grasped the hunter's way. It's about doing what you have to do, regardless of the outcome. And it's about killing your enemy, because he doesn't understand how only the strong have a right to honor. With a scream of undisguised glee, Shorty stepped out to meet her. Ellis understood enough of what was happening to know that Max shouldn't kill the creatures. Bad guys, 5 object. So they watched without acting, as the small woman and the inorganic moved away, each step adding to the numbers that ran across Ellis's eyes, distance and speed. Ellis thought that he might be bleeding. Max didn't register a change in fluids. But there was enough wrong with Max that Ellis decided to abstain from deciding. We have to go now, Ellis. Can you hear? Ellis, can you? Help me pick him up. Max looked down at their friends, not sure who had spoken. Ellis pleased by the sounds of their voices. What are you doing? You said yourselves that Briggs is beyond help. I'll explain later, Ellis. Help me. Jess. Jess wanted their help. He had crouched next to the unmoving human, touching him, trying to move him. Ellis explained to Max what Jess wanted, and Max took a step forward, knees bending, the glowing plane of the ground line rising in front of their eyes. Ellis felt his body moving within, leaning over, and felt warmth against skin, wet motion across his lips. Bleeding. I am bleeding. Jess pushed the human into the crook of Max's right arm, and they stood up, 82.72 kilos heavier than before. Max made adjustments for the difference, taking up enough calculation space that Ellis couldn't make out any more words. Both humans, Lara, Jess, made sounds, speaking, and Ellis understood the meaning, if not what they said. It was time to go. Max and Ellis stepped forward, avoiding the distraction that was taking place 9 meters away, between the small woman and the non-human bad guys. From the sharp sounds and quick movements, they decided it was highly probable that the interaction was violent. Ellis was glad to be leaving. He was getting tired, and thought that he might like to sleep soon.